Hi everyone, that's Black here, and welcome back to my Game Corner. Have you ever wanted to be a participant in Squid Game? Huge cash prizes, exciting games, and life-threatening risks. But what if you replace all those childhood games with parkour sections, added chases where you run from a huge bloodthirsty robot, and turned it all into a killer TV show with a $5 million grand prize? Sounds like an ultimate thrill, right? And since you're so keen to be a part of the show, I'll give you a lucky ticket so you don't have to buy every box of cereals at the store. Today we're reviewing Finding Frankie. Finding Frankie was released on October 25, 2024, and was also developed by Superlow. I actually wanted to review it back in February of last year, when everyone was buzzing about it, but something went wrong and I couldn't fit it into my schedule. So why should you watch this video then? Believe me, Finding Frankie isn't a simple typical mascot horror game you think it is, and you'll soon understand why. The premise is painfully simple. Hidden in packs of Frankie's fruit flakes, you can dig up at the opportunity to participate in Frankie's parkour horror show. Naturally, what looks like a normal fun parkour show turns out to be a bloodbath with bets on the participants. Today's format isn't quite standard, by the way. I'll be quickly retelling a short segment of the game and then going over the specifics of each key moment separately. Well, let's get started. Our adventure begins with an introductory video that sets the scene. As you have already figured out, we're the lucky participant who is about to take a part in Frankie's parkour show. We're up against 3 other competitors. The goal is not only to beat them in parkour, but also to survive the show. 3 more lucky participants will be at the starting line, one of whom, incidentally, will start his race just before the starting signal. He'll pay for it, running straight into the claws of a giant spring-loaded rabbit, Frankie. While the monster deals with other participants, the protagonist manages to slip behind him and escape. The player's next step is accessing a tutorial that briefly demonstrates what's possible in the game: jumping, rolling, swinging on bars, jumping on wall trampolines, and sliding on rails. This knowledge will be enough to quickly navigate the game's parkour sections, of which there are quite a few. Only after this will the player have access to the main lobby, where they'll be shown how switches work. Many doors in the game require a series of switches to be pressed to open them. Sometimes this requires a bit of jumping and running, while other times it is just as simple as walking up to the door and pressing the switch. Opening the main door gives the player access to the first parkour section. I completed it with a few minor quirks, but quite quickly. Overall, there is nothing complicated about this vertical parkour. Let's pause here and review what we just saw. Let's go back to the starting line. This segment was originally intended to, first, introduce the player to the situation and show him the enemy to be very off. Second, to create the effect of surprise, because the player expects at least some small competition in the beginning. I feel like this moment wasn't fully fleshed out. They could have made a short, intuitive chase before moving on to the tutorial, so it wouldn't be just an introduction to Frankie, but a tense chase as well. That would have made the beginning more dynamic and action-packed. As it is, the player essentially just escapes the room with other participants and is immediately safe. Speaking of other participants, 2 of them will indeed be eaten by Frankie, but the 3rd will safely escape this competition. Honestly, I understand the guy. Fuck that, seriously. He'd have to give his life for this. No. It's surprising that our protagonist for some reason can't do that. Apparently he has nothing left to lose. The next section is the tutorial. It's extremely well executed and well thought out. It's short, yet clearly and concisely explains the game's various techniques. It offers an opportunity to better familiarize yourself with the controls and understand how the game works. The only thing I'd note is that the player should be facing the exit, so it's immediately intuitive where to go. The problem here is that if the player doesn't have time to read the current objective at the top, they won't be able to understand what to do next. This is a bit of a problem at all stages of the game. Curious little creatures like me will happily explore the area instead of taking the obvious exit, so it would be better to immediately turn the player to face the current objective. The lobby is the first full-fledged location, where we'll encounter not only switches but also our first small parkour challenge. We'll also find collectibles, assuming you picked up the stuffed bunny from the machines, of course, and we'll encounter a locked door that requires a key. We won't need this door until the end of the game, so you can forget about it for now. For now, this is just a warm-up for the game, introducing some lore elements that should grab the player's attention. Incidentally, you'll be able to return here via shortcut, serving as a reminder of a secret locked door. The next part will be your first chance to show off, quote-unquote. You're in a vertical parkour area with a large red out-of-bounds sign on the floor below, and numerous signs warning against stepping on the floor during parkour. According to the developer's logic, during this part the player will fall at least once to meet Frankie in person for the first time. This is to demonstrate that any fall is risky, because once the player hits the ground, they must quickly find cover where the enraged Frankie won't spot them. Be careful! Frankie looks down on and glances around. If you even slightly enter his line of sight, he will instantly attack, sending you flying to the checkpoint. Upon reaching the second floor, the player will meet a new character, Henry Hotline, and will be forced to flip switches again. After opening the door, the player will have to crawl through the vents a bit, chasing a toy telephone, which incidentally is Henry's head. Between these steps, there will be another switch flipping segment, but this time it's a running sequence. In the vents, the player will encounter Frankie again, but the bunny isn't really allowed to attack right now, so he crawls back until the next room, where a heated chase takes place. After that, the player finds themselves in a food court. Well, while I'm solving the food court puzzle, let's take a closer look at everything we've lived through. Henry Hotline area serves as both a break between sections and an opportunity to meet a new character who will be encountered later. Many rooms here are inaccessible, though they often conceal various lore details. I found it actually amusing. The ventilation systems are also nothing special, except for the fragment with Frankie, which is needed in order to A. Prepare the player for the upcoming chase, B. Make the player understand that Frankie is not just a brainless robot. The section between ventilation shafts is interesting here. It's used to quickly prepare the player for the chase that awaits them. That's why it's simple yet designed for speed. Plus, there are a few barricades and a trampoline to give the player a feel of how it works. Now, let's move on to the chase itself. This is the first intense encounter with Frankie. I'm guessing the game's intent is to get through this section in one go, purely on adrenaline. The knowledge that a killer rabbit is chasing you should push you to act quickly. The escape itself essentially consists of two sections connected by a checkpoint. Both sections feature some new parkour innovations. For example, my main problem until the end of the game will be those spinning tubes. This is largely because backing up while someone or something is running towards you is quite nerve-wracking. But that's essentially the point. The player will have to weave back and forth through these barricades to get through. At the very beginning of the escape, the developers decided to place two sections with switches, one with 6 and the other with 2. This is meant to create a great deal of tension and an adrenaline rush, which should subsequently serve as a boost for completing the section. They also use one of my favorite techniques. Mid-chase, an enemy suddenly appears from the front and the player almost runs into them, forcing them to turn around and run back. I'll add that at the beginning of the section, Frankie literally flies into the player, which is more frightening than any jump scare, but in my opinion, it doesn't play out very well in the long run. On the other hand, this section shouldn't be replayed too many times. Speaking of Frankie himself, as far as I understand, his speed isn't adaptive. However, he moves just at the right speed to give the player room for error, yet still keep him terrified of the approaching rabbit. This, combined with an obstacle course, creates a tense atmosphere where the player is driven solely by adrenaline. Another small, relaxed section, let's call it that, awaits us in the food court, followed by a new, larger parkour room. This area is very bright and airy, with pleasant music playing inside, but remember, falling from the parkour is prohibited. For completing the parkour, the player will receive a duck with a radar, which will help in the next section. Despite the fact that this living tablet also pecks, it looks cute, and in addition to its radar, it can also create a flash of light. There will be a short tutorial for radar in the ventilation system, by the way. After this, the player enters as the stealth section of the game, where they must press 5 telephones while hiding from Henry in a dark labyrinth. At the end of this section, the player faces another chase. Let's stop here in a safer place. We won't go into the details of food court and duck sections, as they're all fairly straightforward, but we'll take a closer look at the chase, stealth and parkour sections. The parkour section is much larger this time. Although there's no time limit, there's still some penalty for falling off the track. I had a rather amusing run-in with Frankie here, which demonstrates that his awareness of the terrain matters. That is, staying behind him temporarily keeps you alive, although he turns around so quickly it's best to hide while he's not yet around. At the end of this section, to the left of the entrance, there's a window that is not visible from the area. This is a big mistake, as it's where the creepy scene with Frankie climbing up the glass will later take place. If people had known about it from the start, they'd more likely to go there right away to look down on the area. Due to the lack of camera lock or anything else to draw players' attention to the window, the chances of missing the giant spring-loaded bunny are quite high. Despite this, Frankie still can be heard, but if the player looks back, they will most likely no longer see anyone. However, another section is important to us now. The most unusual section of the game is Hide and Seek with Henry Hotline. At least that's what it's called on the map at the very beginning of the game, if I remember correctly. At the beginning of this section, in the safe zone, we can press the phone, which will reveal the main objective. I don't fully understand, however, why we're tormenting Henry at all, since apparently the ringing of the phones hurts him. So we're faced with a small dark labyrinth. We need to press 5 phones, well 6 if you count the one we've already pressed. 2 of them are located outside the labyrinth, 2 inside and 1 in the safe zone. As soon as the first phone in the labyrinth rings, Henry starts hunting. Of course, you can hide from him in the safe zone, but it's not hard to escape him in between. That is, if you figure out where he is. Henry makes loud walking sounds, a real stomping sound. However, he doesn't follow the sound of phones, meaning he can't be lured, and has a very strange pathfinding pattern. Sometimes he'll go one way, then change his mind halfway through and head back. Sometimes he'll also bump into walls. Upon seeing the player, Henry will naturally run toward them a little faster than he previously walked. There are several different ways to ring the phones, but the best way is to ring 2 phones on the outside, one on the left and one on the right of the entrance, then run to the safe zone, and from there make a couple of runs towards the phones closer to the middle of the maze. In fact, over time, if this location suddenly becomes challenging, you'll begin to understand its layout, and it will become easier. The main problem here is that it's very dark. You can hardly see anything. You might say that our duck has not only a scanner to see where the phones are, but also a flash. However, using it here is extremely inconvenient, plus it won't stun the enemy. Therefore, it's terribly disadvantageous. This section is quite small, however, and with significant caution, it's not too difficult to navigate. Once completed, however, the player won't be let go. A heated chase ensues, involving Henry and Frankie. I really like the way it's designed, both in terms of environments and sound effects. The environments are absolutely panic-inducing. It's not your typical parkour chase through colorful obstacles, but a truly psychedelic experience that seems to convey Henry's own emotions. Fun fact, there's a secret Frankie toy you can pick up, but unfortunately I didn't know that. If you want to support me with more than just liking and subscribing, consider checking out the link in the description. There you can donate any sum of money starting from $1. Any donation is appreciated. Thank you in advance. The next long segment is a series of various tracks, from overcoming a short obstacle course to solving puzzles. All of this is devoid of any unnecessary tension, save from minor jump scares and various cutscenes. Why is this huge segment needed? for two things. First, the lore component. Here we first meet real Frankie, who talks a little about the show, see the ending of Henry's storyline, and generally gain additional lore insight. For example, on the board in Frankie's room where he monitors the show, information about the bets on the contestants is written. Interestingly, for some reason, 2 contestants are listed as dead, 1 survived, and 1 didn't show up at all. I noticed this for a reason. Why didn't the 4th show up if he did? There were originally 4 of us at the start. 2 were eaten, 1 escaped, and 1 left the show. But for some reason, he wasn't disqualified or left. He just didn't show up at all. By the way, an interesting fact about Frankie. He constantly follows the player, but it's not easy to notice on your first playthrough. He actually present in practically every area, and even at the beginning, you can spot him behind the glass in a trampoline area. He'll also be there in the final challenge, by the way. To access the final challenge, we need to complete 2 sections. One in a small trampoline center and the other in the water park. Both are needed to obtain 2 keys that open the final area, Frankie's Frosted Peak. True, to unlock all this, the player must first face a thalassophobes nightmare. In fact, this location truly struck a chord with me due to my fear of big bodies of water. However, that's essentially what's it for. Also interesting, there is a reference to once popular internet underwater animatronic monster Bert. This amusing little detail was spotted among the textures. I actually think it's a rather unusual reference, but it definitely adds a bit to atmosphere to the segment. Now I'm even less interested in knowing what might be lurking in the depths of the sewer. Back to those 2 key segments. Let's start with the trampoline segment, since it's more boring. It just so happens that this segment is a repeat of the same thing 3 times in a row. On one hand, bouncing on trampolines through rings is really fun, even 3 times in a row. But besides that, after each time we have to catch these little guys called noobs. They also look a bit like rabbits and scream in a similar way, by the way. They're probably meant to be a shock effect or just a reminder that the game is still horror, because after you catch them, they explode, disintegrating into thick cherry jam. The joke would be even funnier if Frankie's company was selling jam. I find this segment a bit drawn out and boring. The repetition of the same thing is getting a bit overused even after the second time, to be honest. However, I think the developers tried to stretch out the fun without going overboard. The lack of activities in this section was a bit of a letdown. The second major segment is the water park. It's a fairly large and dark place with water slides, our favorite switches, and propellers. This segment is actually less intense and a bit longer, but more action-packed in my opinion. You can even slide down the slides. The developers knew players would want to. It's great that in this segment the game rewards exploration, not only with fun slides, but also with another collectible toy. It's too bad that choosing the more difficult path to the switch is no longer encouraged. Ultimately, there are 2 possible paths, saws on the left and trampolines on the right. Which one will you choose? Obviously, the one on the right is easier, however, it's easy to miss, especially if you're incredibly inattentive. The one on the left is more difficult, especially giving the initial sense of urgency. For such a fast-paced and dynamic game, where sharp camera turns are a crucial part of the gameplay, such slow movement strictly along the pipe with no option to even slightly stay away from the path is simply strange, if not unacceptable. Of course, I can be proud of myself because I completed it, and by the way, I had a good time. This raises the question. There is a harder but more fun route, and there is an easier but therefore more boring route. Was this variability really the intention? However, wouldn't have been a better decision to make both routes fun and moderately difficult? Frankly, I don't quite understand this decision. Beyond the huge door, the final parkour challenge awaits, a towering wall that must be climbed before the water reaches the player. It is a varied speed test with some sharp turns. The player will have to demonstrate all their abilities and skills. The climb up the mountain itself is quite varied and interesting. It allows the player to show off their full capabilities. It's not that difficult and the water is extremely gentle, especially if you run the first couple of slopes quickly. There is no adaptive speed feature in the game, so reaching the top isn't too difficult. And there is even the opportunity to slow down. But those damn tubes with barriers, the most nerve-wracking and annoying section. Moreover, in the next part after this parkour, we'll have a wonderful mini challenge where the same barriers will be located between spinning saws in a very small space. At this point, the player is already quite calm and general nervousness is behind them, but that's not all. Immediately after completing the challenge, we'll have some more parkour and the final meetup with Frankie. Hexa Havoc! It's a boss fight that is a bit like TNT Run from Minecraft. Essentially, we're faced with 5 level width platforms made of plates that fall after a certain amount of time has passed. You need to survive for about over 2 minutes without falling to the bottom. Frankie can also destroy the plates, by the way. Once the timer runs out, you need to pull the lever, which will cause a multitude of noobs to fall from the sky, and the challenge itself will be destroyed. The challenge itself isn't that difficult. It's easiest to run along the edge, tightening the circle. However, don't forget about Frankie, who also destroys those blocks. Incidentally, he can also kill you if he catches up. Overall, the longer I've managed to last on single level is about 30 seconds. By the way, while we're running around the set, some cool driving dubstep is playing in the background. I really like what Frankie says at this point. Yo! It sounds a bit like Franco Barbie from Outlast Trials, both in voice and intonation. It made me smile and warmed up my heart. The segment is still quite nerve-wracking due to the timer at the top. It's unsettling to fall too far and fall to the very bottom, which can make your movements more jerky and awkward, especially when there is an oversized rabbit breathing down your neck. On the other hand, it's the final challenge and it's worth the effort to complete gracefully. Ultimately, Frankie, a multitude of noobs, and the player themselves fall into the massive dump pit we saw earlier. I bet you didn't see that the ceiling in this room actually contains Hexa Havoc blocks. It seems like that's the end of it, but the protagonist survives and wins the final prize. Well, not quite. You see, we've brought the show such ratings and become such a shining star that Frankie can't just let us go. And that means the show must go on and will be its star attraction for many seasons to come. So, what do we have in the end? Finding Frankie is a highly unusual mascot horror game, focusing on dynamic parkour instead of slow exploration and numerous jump scares. This is a highly unusual approach to the genre, as horror games typically focus on slow progression and exploration of locations to immerse the player in the atmosphere, which is often dark and oppressive. In Finding Frankie, the game is, on contrary, bright, fast-paced and light. The main tension comes from the chases. However, that's not the only thing the game has going on for it. Finding Frankie utilizes various mechanics and gameplay for variety, combining the core dynamic chases with stealth segments that evoke fear in different ways. This makes the game varied and highly engaging. Moreover, the main plot in this game focuses on a highly elaborate show, while the subplot is what we're rarely shown in the game: what's behind the scenes. Numerous details, interesting notes, references, and overall content are hidden in the textures and their names, as well as behind closed doors. I believe the developers were counting on theoretics to tackle the game, and I think they succeeded in creating that very mystery that so often lacks in many games of this format. On the other hand, it's important to remember that the player needs to be nudged through all these mysteries to become more interested. In any case, Finding Frankie is certainly worth checking out. Moreover, news recently surfaced that the second Finding Frankie game will be released. The first trailers are supposedly due this summer, but the game's release date is still unknown. I suspect it will either partially answer some questions or further reveal what's going on in Frankie's parkour complex. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave your thoughts on the game in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already. We have a lot of interesting stuff here. Have a nice one. Bye!